Welcome to this analysis of Pedro Navaja, a 1978 salsa composition by singer-activist Ruben and composer-arranger-activist Willie Colon. I mentioned that Colon and Blades are activists because that has an important impact on the composition and production of this song, as well as the production of the album from which it comes, Siembra, which means sowing. This song dramatizes an imagined vignette from life in the barrio. Thus, like a lot of salsa, it portrays the barrio as the site of cultural production. But this isn't exactly a glorification of the barrio in any straightforward manner. Pedro Navaja, or Pete the Knife, is a criminal who employs larceny and even murder to survive. In this narrative, Pedro comes upon an unnamed prostitute who is having trouble on this particular day finding clients. She has a drink to pass the time and has a gun for protection. As she returns to the street, Pedro stabs her in an effort to rob her of the little money she has. She fires the gun into Pedro. They both die, and she declares that he is nothing. A drunk then comes along and takes the 2 pesos, the knife, and the gun, and stumbles away singing, "Life is full of surprises." The song is modeled, both musically and narratively, on Die Moralität von Mack Messer, better known in the U.S. as Mack the Knife, by Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill from their 3-penny opera of 1928. This opera was an adaptation of John Gay's ballad opera, The Beggar's Opera, of 1728. The point of all 3 works, Pedro Navaja, The Beggar's Opera, and the 3-penny opera, is to invert the usual world, whether depicted in opera or salsa, of heroes by following and perhaps to a certain extent glorifying the exploits of the anti-hero, the thief, the pimp, the murderer. In essence, John Gay, Bertolt Brecht, and Ruben Blades are all suggesting that the world is not so easily divided into heroes and villains, and they suggest this by examining, even if only implicitly, the class distinctions that reinforce the differentiation of good and evil, hero and villain. Navaja is depicted as having a certain swagger, a sense of savoir-faire, knowing how to accomplish things, knowing how to make his way. He is a victimizer, he's a predator. But implicitly, at least, he's also a victim of his own class standing. His inability to perform the things that he's good at doing in a socially acceptable manner forces him to turn to crime. After all, what is the successful businessman if not also a predator? But his predation is socially acceptable, while a thief's predation is illicit and proscribed. This is Brecht's view of life under capitalism. It is inherently unfair, inherently stacked against the underclass. It is also an insight of Sigmund Freud's. In his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud suggests that we are all, in a manner of speaking, predators. And yet we are also deeply social animals. Most predatory animals are isolates. They live at best in small groups or alone. Animals that live in large groups, like ants or bees or geese, tend to be more overtly cooperative. Somehow we, and certain other primates, are both. We are social predators, a conflict in terms. That is what Pedro Navaja represents. Let's turn to the song. So Pedro Navaja begins with an instrumental introduction that's a pretty impressive example of the horn writing in salsa, and it comes very much from that salsa tradition. In fact, even the specific voicings and harmonies are very much grounded in that tradition developed by, for instance, Eddie Palmieri, and then, of course, Willie Colon, who's the arranger and co-composer of this particular song. That first chord is a C chord of some sort, but as you can see, and I'll show you the notation in a bit, the bottom part of it is stacked fourths. So we have the C to the F to the B flat to the E, right? So those are all stacked fourths. The upper part of the chord is also fourths, G to C. The only non-fourth here is between the E and the G. So we get that big sound, right? It's not exactly a major chord. It's a suspended chord of some sort, but it's almost not treated as one. It's not one that has to resolve exactly. It just simply goes to the next chord, which is this one, right? And that's an E flat, G, so there's some thirds, but then we start with the fourths again. So the G up to the C a fourth, C up to F a fourth, and F up to B flat a fourth. So again, these 2 chords that are mostly based around fourths, like that. And then we get this pedal on D while the horns are playing a line that's part of the typical 3-3-2 rhythm, right? 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2, and then that's just outlining more or less an F6 chord, and then an E major chord, then an E flat major chord to D, right? So we have those stacked chords, the fourth chords, and then the D pedal with these descending chords over it. Right? And then it ends with that little lick that's just a C scale missing the sixth, but to emphasize the end and prepare us for the song to come. Let's take a look at the notation of those opening chords. So then the singing begins, and at first the singing is accompanied only by the hand drum. There's no underlying chords. And as you can see, the voice, especially at first, doesn't really define anything. It's just... So this alternation mostly between G and A, which we could harmonize in all sorts of different ways, but as it progresses, we start to get a sense of what that underlying harmony probably is. So the next part of that verse is... and then... So that chromatic motion that's being underlined or outlined underneath it, the C to C sharp to D, starts to give us a sense of what the harmonies would be. And in fact, when they do come in, a couple verses later, we start to really get a sense of what's happening, that we're in C. Right? So it's this constant use of the C sixth chord, so a C chord with the A as part of the chord. And that's important because most of the melody is just going from the G to the A, and so above that chord, both of them are constant. But then you get a little tension with this applied chord, the 5 of 2, the A7 chord, and then going right to 2. And then with the G7 alternating with that. So 2, so 5, 7, back to the 1, right? And then we get this dip down into the lower register. Right? Notice that we end the melody on the A, so we're not really in some sense we're not going anywhere. We're just still hovering around that A. Now, the song, as you can see from the form chart that will be on our Blackboard site, one of the things you see from that form chart is we don't stay in the key of C, right? So the first several verses are in the key of C, even the one that doesn't have anything underlying it exactly, that just has the hand drum underlying it. So verses 1 through 3 are all in C. Then verses 4 through 5 move up to C sharp, then we move up to D, then E flat, and then we arrive at E. Notice how this works. The first verse is discussing Pedro Navaja, giving us a sense of who he is, that he walks with a certain casualness that handsome people walk with, right? So he's got a certain style in the way that he moves. The next verse is still about Navaja and his teeth and the way he wears his hat and so on. The next verse, verse 3, still in C, is about the mujer, about the woman, the prostitute who's having a rough day and not getting many clients. So notice that when we're introducing the characters, we're in the key of C. Then there's a little bit of tension that arises with the move of everything up a half step. It's the same song structure, but everything moves up a half step to C sharp. And this is where we get the reference to the police. This is where we get the notion of the deserted street. It moves up another half step to D, and this is where the action begins. Navaja crosses the street, and we find out that the woman has a gun that she shifts from her pocket to her purse. Then we shift up another half step, and this is the only time where we're only going to get one verse in this key. Verse 8 is in E flat, and it's the only verse in E flat, and that's where the stabbing and the gunshot occurs. And remember that the gunshot goes off as though it's a cannon, right? So this is the crux. And then we push up one more half step to E for the woman's line that, you know, she knew she was going to have a miserable day, but Navaja is worth nothing. Right? And also in E is verse 10, where the drunk fellow arrives and steals their money, their gun, and their knife, and walks away singing now a new phrase, a similar phrase, but still new, in the key of E still, that life is full of surprises, surprises is what life is full of. So you have this, what's called in poetry or poetic analysis, a chiasmus, right? The first line, life is full of surprises, is answered by the second line, surprises is what life is full of. So they kind of work almost like a palindrome. And then that motto gives way to an instrumental interlude. And notice that the instrumental interlude, what's interesting about it is it goes from C to E. So just like the song so far has moved up chromatically, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, or E flat to E, right? So it's moved from C to E. Now this instrumental interlude, which is constructed out of 5-bar phrases, which is a little odd, obviously, for dance music. It's also moving from C up to E. And then the second part of the interlude will bring us down from E to C7, and then finally at the end of the interlude, when after you hear "I Like to Live in America," the quote from West Side Story, you finally get the B7 chord, and we return to the key of E. Right? So notice that these instrumental interlude sections, they're just in some ways recapitulating the harmonic range that we've already explored within the song as a whole. And obviously the point of raising up a half step with each verse is to add more and more excitement. I don't think of this as quite the same thing, even though strictly speaking, this is similar to a truck driver modulation where you just take the whole thing and move it up. But because it's not at the end of a tune that's really just used for emotional effect, here I think it serves more as an element of the drama. I think that's what this is all about in some ways. Now, very quickly, the end returns to those same opening chords, those same fourth chords that we had at the very beginning, and then that same pedal too with the. But now we just end on that D chord. And that D chord, of course, should feel in some ways unsatisfying. Of course, it's the end of this chromatic descent, and so in one sense resolves it, but in a deeper sense, nothing is resolved. The story goes on. Just because Pedro Navaja is dead doesn't mean that the life on the streets, so to speak, the problem of the life on the streets and the sort of Brechtian underpinning of that a lot of this has to do with the people that seem as though they are the assailants are also victims, right? And that goes on. So that D chord that just hovers there leaves us with that impression. That's it for today. Thanks.